Dear friends, concerned citizens here in Stockholm and around the world, welcome to the Stockholm Plus 50 Climate Hub, a stage and an online space available to you before, during and after the climate conference Stockholm Plus 50 until World Environment Day on the 5th of June. The Stockholm Plus 50 Climate Hub is hosted by United Nations Development Programme and the organization We Don't Have Time. My name is Isabella Lövin. I'm the chair of Stockholm Environment Institute Board. I'm also the former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, and I also used to be the Minister of Climate and Environment and International Development Cooperation. Today, we will take you back to the Environment Conference in Stockholm in 1972. We will speak with Mr. Jan Mårtensson, who was there, who was responsible for organizing the conference, to learn about what happened around this time and in the aftermath of the Stockholm Conference on Human Environment in 1972. We will also speak with the Swedish Minister for Development Cooperation, Ms. Matilda Ernkrans, and the Administrator of United Nations Development Programme, Mr. Achim Steiner, about their expectations on Stockholm Plus 50. Starting 50 years ago and tracing our steps since then, we hope to be able to answer this. What can we realistically expect from Stockholm Plus 50? And to all you in the audience, I want you to stay engaged on the social media using the hashtag UNDP_hour.
In 1972, global leaders came together in Sweden for the first ever United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. It was unlike any previous event, bringing together 113 governments to discuss humanity's impact on the natural world.
It is clear that the environmental crisis which is confronting the world will profoundly alter the future destiny of our planet. No one amongst us, whatever our status, strength or circumstance, can remain unaffected.
The human environment will always change. Development will continue. There will be growth. This cannot and should not be avoided. The decisive question is in which direction we will develop, by what means we will grow, which qualities we want to achieve, and what values we wish to guide our future.
I think the lasting message of the Stockholm Conference will be the realization that man has come to one of those seminal points in his history where his own activities are the principal determinants of his own future.
Now, 50 years after that Stockholm meeting, we face a triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, as well as other planetary ills that are affecting our current and future well-being.
This triple crisis is our number one existential threat, and we need an urgent, all-out effort to turn things around.
An unhealthy planet threatens human health, prosperity, equality, and peace, as we have seen only too clearly in COVID-19. It also threatens the achievement of SDGs. In this moment of truth, we need to urgently work to transform our economies and societies. The science is clear. The solutions are known. We need whole of society action for a whole of society problem. We know it can be done. The world came together to fix the ozone layer, phase out leaded fuel, and stop endangered species from going extinct. With this in mind, the UN General Assembly has decided to convene an international meeting entitled Stockholm Plus 50, a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, our responsibility, our opportunity. It will be held in Stockholm, Sweden, from the 2nd till the 3rd of June 2022. It will commemorate the 50 years since that 1972 watershed moment when the environment took center stage for the first time. There is only one Earth, and the stakes have never been higher. Join us.
Following these sounds and images from the 1972 Stockholm Conference, it's now my pleasure to welcome to the stage someone who has been there. In fact, our guest now is the person who had an almost impossible mission to make this groundbreaking conference happen and to make it a success. Ambassador Jan Mårtensson has had a long career as a diplomat, both on the Swedish and international arena. Among other things, he was the UN Undersecretary for Disarmament, Director General of UN European Office in Geneva, and Undersecretary for Human Rights. And we will also be speaking to him today because he was the Secretary General of the Swedish National Committee for the Stockholm Conference 1972, with an overall responsibility for planning and carrying out the conference. So I'll move over to you, Ambassador Mårtensson.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure to have you here, and I'd like to start with a very basic question. How did it happen that you came to lead on creating this historical conference?
Do you really want to know?
Yes, I do.
No, I had a good friend who was Minister of Agriculture, Ingemar Bengtsson, at the time, and he was later on the chairman and president of the Stockholm Conference. And he asked me once at a dinner, he said, I'm going to have a very big thing, a very big conference in Stockholm. The government says it will be too big, and the Minister of Finance said, oh, it's too expensive, but I'll have it. Can you assist me? And then he said, I don't care what you do. I don't care what the cost will be, but it has to be damn good. That was almost the only instructions I got. Mm-hmm. And I established a national committee in order to bring in the entire Swedish society, political parties, trade unions, etc. And I asked the world-famous Swedish opera singer Birgit Nilsson to sing at the opening of the conference, because I thought that should take place at the Royal Opera. I mean, that would be an appropriate sort of start of the entire thing. And yes, that's how it started as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. So what were the major concerns on the environment at that time? And what were the expectations of this conference? Because this was the first time ever the UN convened on the environment.
Well, sadly, it didn't exist actually in the mind of the general public. You had warning voices such as Rachel Carson in Silent War and Silent Spring, and quite a few other, not least in Sweden, who saw the realities. But when in the public mind, the industrial chimneys with sort of smokestacks and foam on waterways were seen as progress and development, and one didn't realize outside the cradle of experts what was going to happen or could happen. And it was interesting also from another point of view, because Sweden invited the United Nations to hold the conference in Stockholm in '72, and it proved that even a relatively small country could push something through the United Nations system and create an event of historic proportions, because that was the very starting point of the entire environmental movement, which didn't exist before, which is now one of the priorities of the world and of the United Nations. Mm-hmm.
So it was a novel theme for the member states of the UN to discuss in the Stockholm Conference. What was the atmosphere during the conference?
I'll tell you what, the sun was bright, the sky was blue, and everyone was in a very good mood and spirit. And the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General of the conference, Maurice Strong, the Canadian, he managed to settle the sort of political problems in the beginning. And we had, for instance, in order to show that this was an environmental conference, I arranged for hundreds of white bicycles to be spread all over Stockholm, to be used by anyone, just occasionally. And Maurice Strong and I were bicycling on white bicycles on the front page of Herald Tribune. So, I mean, we made a point. It's an environmental conference.
Okay. Was it all sunshine and everyone happy?
Yes.
Or were there some kind of controversy as well during the conference?
Well, there were problems in the sense that developing countries feared that it was a ploy by the developed countries in order to stop the competitiveness and the development. And the developed countries thought that this could be a danger in restricting our industries and so on and so forth. But that was settled. But the main problem was the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, because they wanted to get East Germany invited, but the problem was that East Germany wasn't a member of UN, so they thought they could get East Germany in through the back door. But so we didn't know until the very end if the Russians and their allies would appear at the conference or not. So we have to plan for 2 conferences, which didn't make life easier.
And in the end, they didn't come.
They didn't come, yeah, that's correct. So we had 133 countries coming and 250 non-governmental organizations, which was important, and of course a lot of journalists.
And would you say that the conference was a success?
Yes.
Was that the feeling afterwards, that you actually accomplished something?
It was, because as you know, the conference yielded results with the declaration and the resolutions and recommendations. I mean, for instance, one result, very important, was the creation of UNEP,
Exactly.
the United Nations Environment Programme, and also, not least, that the world stated that a healthy and sound human environment is a human right.
Yes. And now, Ambassador, 50 years later, we see a lot of young children on the streets protesting because adults haven't really reacted strongly enough on the environment crisis. And what would you say to them? What do we need to fix our problems?
Well, I think it's very encouraging to see the younger generations being so involved. But they should exert pressure on politicians and on parents and on whomever, and don't throw away plastic bags in the street. Jokingly apart, but I mean, it's a very positive trend, a very positive sign to see this involvement of the younger generation.
Yes, but it's also kind of showing that what was started in Stockholm in 1972 isn't finished 50 years later.
No, we have come a long way in spite of everything, but not too long. Not.
Okay. So I would also like to ask you about the logistics around this conference. Because you mentioned to me earlier when we spoke about that there was a security issue at that time as well.
Yes, it was. And about logistics, the first thing I did, apart from Birgit Nilsson, was to reserve 5,000 hotel rooms. It wasn't enough, but it was a good start. And we applied an operation which I called Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith was a delegate, non-existing, but from Perth in Australia, and we followed him from the very moment that he got a phone call from his governor saying he would be a delegate, and until he went to Arlanda airport, and then for 2 weeks in Sweden, and sort of tried to imagine everything that could possibly happen to this poor guy. Yeah. And then we multiplied with 5,000, and it worked very well. And security, we had, of course, problems because terrorist organizations, Baader-Meinhof and others, were sort of prominent in Europe. Mm. And we had information about big demonstrations from Japan and whatever. And there were bomb threats, but we managed to cope with it, fortunately, because just a few months after, Israeli athletes were killed in Munich, as you remember.
Yes.
So we avoided this kind of thing to happen.
Mm. So we had huge differences in the world even back then. Now we're in the middle of the war in Ukraine, and we also don't know how international cooperation will be affected by that when it comes to environment. But one thing that you already mentioned is that you wanted to bring in the civil society and the
Yes.
private sector. And could you tell us more what your thinking was?
During my entire UN career, I have been very keen on bringing in the NGO community, because they are worldwide and they observe and they can see sort of first-hand violation of human rights, for instance, etc., and bring it forward into the UN fora. And therefore, we arranged a non-governmental organization forum at the conference, where they could sort of have their own conference with the input from delegates from the major conference, and cooperation and exchange of views and so on and so forth. So and that has afterwards become a standard within the UN to bring in the NGOs.
Because that wasn't really something that was very well looked at from the UN side, to bring in non-member states, so to speak.
Oh no, I mean, some member states wasn't too keen on having the public to participate in decisions. So there's UN is an organization of states, not for odd kind of non-governmental organizations, because they were afraid of the NGOs bringing in controversial material in the discussions, because if they were accredited to the ECOSOC, they could participate in conferences.
So you were a pioneer there in that sense.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, I still believe that the NGOs play a very important role.
Absolutely. And were there also NGOs and other civil society participants from other countries coming to Stockholm at that time?
Oh yes, 250.
Wow.
And we also arranged a less formal side conference for young people outside, where they could have scenes and microphones and play guitar and do whatever, and have their own sort of conference, which they was appreciated by the participants. And we had, for instance, sort of things happening. I got a call from Arlanda Airport, the police, saying that we have a group of Indians from Canada, and they have a buffalo hide, and they have something written on it, and they said, we don't need passports because we own the globe, the earth, and shall we kick them out? There's a lot of journalists and photographs. And I said, let them in, I take the responsibility. And they came very peacefully, and they participated, and they went back home. So, I mean, there were all kinds of little events were taking place.
That's beautiful. I wonder if that would be possible today, to come with a buffalo hide and say, well, I'm a global citizen, I can come into your country.
Yes, you have to be, well, I think one thing when you organize such a big event, you have to be pragmatic.
Yes.
And not to be sort of looking into the tunnel saying, we can't do this, it has not been done. And you say, okay, we'll fix it. And everything went well.
And there was a war going on at that time too in Vietnam. And
oh yes.
There was talk about napalm and being an ecocide.
At the opening ceremony, we had Robert McNamara in the South Vietnamese delegation, and we had Israelis, Arabs, and all kinds of conflict possibilities. While we sort of took care of it.
And you did very well. So thank you so much, Ambassador Jan Mårtensson, for accepting the invitation and coming here and sharing your memories and your experiences.
Thank you. But allow me to make a quote from one of my favorite American writers, Mark Twain,
yes.
Because I think that's something to be remembered. He said that the history of mankind is a deplorable episode on one of the minor planets. There is only one Earth, okay?
Well, I think we're a really important exception in that black space. But thank you so much, Jan Mortensson, for coming here.
You're welcome.
We will move to the next talk with some voices around the world, talking directly to world leaders and urging them to take action to save our planet, to save lives and livelihoods. Starting last year during COP26, UNDP created a platform for people from all over the world to address world leaders directly, voice their concerns about climate change and urge them to take action. This was an immediate success. Dear World Leaders received submissions from over 70 countries in 28 languages. Recently, it even won the Webby Award, an international award honoring excellence on the internet in the activism category. So let's have a glimpse on some of the messages sent, starting with the words, Dear World Leaders.
Dear World Leaders, we've been driving the boat for a while now, and we're running out of time.
Climate is not changing. Climate has already changed.
If we don't act now, my generation will be living with the consequences.
It
makes me feel restless that that's the reality we're living in today.
We've had increasing amount of wildfires in the summer. When I was little, this never really happened.
The heavy rainfall caused a series of flash floods and landslides.
Schools closed during peak pollution days. Air pollution has become part of life here.
Shifting seasons cause heavy rain in one area or drought in another.
Мы замечаем, что во многих регионах страны наступила засуха и остро не хватает воды.
Upravo sam dobio dojavu o požaru koji se nalazi na susjednom brdu tu.
It affects mental health. It will only take 3 days of continuous rain to put us underwater again.
World leaders, you must keep your commitment.
Give back to the world its beautiful skylines, which many of us haven't fully seen in years.
Protect the existing natural forests and restore additional forests and green areas.
Not a day goes by that I'm not living in fear that I'm not doing enough for the climate crisis. So my request to you is that you do the same.
If not us, who will decide our future?
This is the generation and the decade where we need to take action before it is too late.
Naime, klimatske promjene više nisu toliko daleko od nas. One su sada jako blizu i ne smijemo ih ignorisati.
If we don't care about these problems, there is not next generation and we will be the last generation.
Em, những người trẻ luôn sẵn sàng hành động và ủng hộ các hành động để bảo vệ trái đất.
I am hoping I will still be here at a time to take meaningful action.
So I'm now joined by two guests, Ms. Matilda Ernkrans, Swedish Minister for Development Cooperation, and Mr. Achim Steiner, the Administrator of United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. So there you are. Good to see you.
You're a double act.
Yes, you're double act. Achim, welcome to Stockholm. So great to see you. Well, let's dive straight into the difficult question. I want to put it to both of you. What can we realistically expect from Stockholm Plus 50? Who wants to start? Matilda.
You want me to start? I think we should expect that this is a global gathering to get us on track again and actually do what we can to act now, because we have made so many promises. So I hope that Stockholm Plus 50 will give a push on acting and doing what we are supposed to do, trying to save the planet and the livelihood on the planet. And I think UNDP is playing an important role in up to this conference, but also onto the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, because UNDP has done an amazing job when it comes to gathering people's voices, but also commitment to actually get climate change financed and done throughout 60 countries, I think.
Right. Kim, what do you think we can realistically expect out of this gathering?
You know, I was just listening to Ambassador Mortensen. I think the first thing that an event like this can do is celebrate leadership and vision, because 1972 wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for a lot of people thinking ahead, daring to imagine something that today we take for granted. And, you know, we'll come to the balance sheet of where we are in 2022, but the ambassador spoke about, you know, out of Stockholm was born the United Nations Environment Programme, the first time that the world acknowledged that environment deserved distinct attention in terms of what it meant and what it meant to different people. I think we also here at Stockholm 50 or plus 50 in the year 2022 clearly have to reflect on why is it that we only got this far and not further, because in some ways we are not at a point 50 years after Stockholm where we can say with confidence, actually we are on a different trajectory. Climate change, loss of biodiversity, you know, the intersection between environment and human well-being, all of this has become more intense, more complex, and with less time to solve it. But I'm sure we'll come back to it. But let's just celebrate for a moment, not just 1972, but the 50 years since, in civil society, in science, in politics. I mean, there have been extraordinary stories of leadership, and they ultimately create moments of opportunity, I think.
Great, so let's celebrate the successes, but not kind of relax, because we have a lot of things to do ahead. And I wanted to ask you, Achim, that's the right pronunciation. For those that don't know the United Nations Development Programme, could you just describe its mandate when it comes to what relates to the environment?
Well, as a development program, in theory, since it was established in the 60s, it should have addressed environmental issues as an integral part of the development pathways that countries pursue. Now, as we know, it took all of our countries, whether it is Sweden or Swaziland or, you know, whoever in the world, a long time to bring that environmental sustainability dimension into the mainstream of development decision-making. Today, UNDP is one of the largest entities in the UN. It is at the center of the UN development system. It is present in 170 countries, and it is a partner to developing countries in trying to address the many challenges they face. They need to create access to electricity, but they're also expected to create a low-carbon development path. They're supposed to combat poverty, but you also have to make sure that citizens in urban areas don't run out of water. We live in a very complex world where climate change and the environmental change phenomena have come on top of some of the things that we considered basic development priorities in the 60s and 70s. So today, and I certainly view my tenure as head of UNDP as a moment in time where development finally embraces the environmental and the sustainability dimensions of development as central drivers of what happens next in development. So when we spent the last 20 years debating whether we can afford to go for clean energy, whether decarbonization means stopping development, today I believe UNDP is the institution that can help countries show that decarbonization is the future of development, and everywhere across the world, every day, in thousands of projects. It's a large organization working, however, in a very decentralized fashion on the frontiers of development as the UN's partner to countries in addressing this.
And you're not as famous as some other UN organizations like UNICEF or UNHCR, but UNDP is actually very much the feet on the ground, doing the real development work and being present in very many countries.
Certainly, I mean, we are a UN family, and some of you know that I once had the privilege of leading UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, and to me it is, it's in a sense a perfect transition. UNEP has been at the forefront of helping the world understand what science was telling us, creating the platforms for acting together on, you know, for example, the ozone layer, the Vienna Convention, the Montreal Protocol, and the many treaties and agreements since, and helping countries to also explore what is an environmental sustainability agenda for a country. But UNDP is very much the organization that works right next to where, in a sense, intent becomes action. So it is the operationalization of much of what Stockholm 1972 and hopefully Stockholm 2022, the Paris Agreement, but also issues such as poverty, inequality, gender, the emergence of digital possibilities. UNDP is an institution that tries to help governments not address environment on Monday as if that was an issue for Monday, and then, gender equity on Tuesday. Every government, as you know better than I do, every day has to deal with the complexity of development choices. We are the organization that tries to connect, human ingenuity, global best practice, and a very continuous partnership with where every day millions of people have to invent the future again and again.
Great, and that is really, really needed. And we also need countries that are active and take an active role for sustainable development. And Matilda, what can we do as countries and donors and partners in order to ensure a healthy environment for all?
Well,
what is the role of Sweden?
Yeah, but I think you need countries and governments who are very decisive on the climate agenda, and the Swedish government, we are prioritizing this. We say that we will double our climate funding. We are just today, and then because it's a UN conference here, Stockholm Plus 50, we have also highlighted that we will increase our funding when it comes to the strategic work when it comes to environment, climate and biodiversity, and we are doubling our finances to the Green Fund. Global Green Fund. So I think that's showing leadership, but this is not something that sort of one country or one government can do on their own. I think everybody needs to chip in. The civil society, private sector, other countries, and that's also why I think it's so important with Stockholm Plus 50, because it also shows that this is something that we believe in, the multilateralism, that we need to act together, and that we are at the sort of Swedish development cooperation, we can do our part, but that's a part of a bigger solution that that every actor need to sign on. And I think listening to UNDP, I think it's important to show what important work the UN organization, what important role they play, and when it comes, because it's difficult, you need to handle complex materials and different kinds of crises and challenges, and often we are very good at talking about challenges and crises. But I also want to talk about sort of the positive agenda that lies within transforming our societies to a more greener and fairer societies, and I think Stockholm Plus 50 is also, as the Ambassador Jan Mårtensson said, it's also a time to reflect on, of course, what challenges we have ahead of us, but also what we have achieved. And I think, and Ashim also touched upon it. I think if you look upon all the fights that have been fought and actually won, and now there are so many more who actually see that it's profitable to invest in sustainable solutions. And I think that's an important work that UNDP has done up to Stockholm Plus 50 and onwards. And it was Swedish government to also fund that and gave that sort of mission to UNDP to work with 60 countries and helping them to support them as partners on finding the right ways to find finance to and it's happening now to actually transform their societies in a more sustainable way. It's not only environmentally right, it's also economically a good choice. So also sort of, I also want to sort of celebrate and highlight all the positive things that also being done throughout the world, even though I know the challenges are massive.
Yes. No, but that's right. There's a lot of going on around the world. But still, in hindsight, we've seen 50 years of international development cooperation, 50 years of environmental conventions, etc. And still we are here we still have poverty, inequality, we still have huge environmental problems. So, Achim, or both of you, is international development cooperation working the way it should to support the transition for a sustainable world? Maybe, Achim, you want to start.
Well, just in these days in particular, I'm sort of reminded that we sometimes project onto international development cooperation, first of all, a mythical assumption. We think that we spend a lot on development cooperation. There have been wonderful surveys in the United States when people were asked, how many cents out of a dollar are we actually spending on development cooperation in the United States? And people had anything from 10 cents to 20 cents to 30 cents a dollar. The United States spends 0.3 or 0.32 cents per dollar on actually development cooperation. So the first thing I think we need to realize that in a world that we have begun to understand and comprehend is incredibly interdependent, where, the war in Ukraine is not only a war that is happening with all the tragedy and trauma now in Ukraine, it is as an event feelable across the planet because of the way we are interdependent on our food markets, on our fuel markets, and even on our capital markets. So overnight, you see a world that is highly interdependent, but it is also still extremely unequal. And much of the journey into Stockholm 72, since Stockholm up to today, is also a debate between the developed and the developing world about how do we come together in this world from which we all know we can benefit, but actually at the moment, by not working together, we are undermining each other. And I think development cooperation right now is once again becoming a subject in the crosshairs of domestic battles about do we spend money on ourselves or do we spend money on, the UN, the bureaucracy, or some people somewhere in the world. It's a tragedy of our political discourse that we're still having this discussion. And let me remind you, as we sit here today, the richest part of the world, the so-called OECD DAC nations, still together do not invest more than 0.33% of their GDP in development cooperation. And yet, we expect to have an energy revolution. We expect to eradicate poverty. We are expected to stop pandemics in their tracks. We are supposed to help countries essentially deal with the whole, for instance, phenomenon of inequality between men and women, girls' education, working in crisis countries like Afghanistan. So we don't go back to where we were not 18 or 19 years ago, but 22, 23 years ago. September 11, remember where that started? But, we are completely underfunding that system that we expect to carry the world. And I often say the Secretary General's regular budget for the Secretary of the United Nations is just a little bit more than New York citizens pay for their fire department. So just for a moment, take that and then ask yourself, are we actually projecting onto this notion of development cooperation some magic formula or some miraculous process of turning straw into gold? Because we are literally supposed to take the Paris Agreement right now. We are negotiating for years on this $100 billion of co-investment. And here we are in Stockholm, we are still debating essentially the environmental transitions as if we were all the same on this planet. And what may surprise some people is that the developing world spends hundreds of billions already today on investing in renewable energy. But the perception is that in asking the richer part of the world to invest 100 billion, they have to somehow do the upfront payment as charity. And this is what is going wrong in our economics of environmental and sustainability discourse and development cooperation. Nature conservation is the same. Some of the loudest critics in developed countries when they speak about loss of biodiversity in the global south have no idea that there are many countries across the world that have dedicated up to a third of their country to conservation-led land use. And they are paying the bill for that. First of all, in terms of foregoing the use of the land, but secondly, struggling to put the rangers in place, the infrastructure to protect wildlife. And yet in the Biodiversity Convention, we still somehow come to the conclusion that any request to share the costs of this global heritage is an unreasonable request. I know money is not something we like to talk about, and it's not all about money. But to pretend that you can ask people who are poor, who are in this moment, particularly right now, facing fiscal deficits that are almost leading them to bankruptcy after the pandemic, to step up on the climate agenda, to step up on the sustainability agenda without sharing and co-investing is asking the impossible. So I think we do need to take the discussion about development cooperation forward. I think it is a very different era. This is not the era of development aid anymore. No. It is an era of development cooperation so that together we can make the transition to a low-carbon economy, to a more sustainable green economy, a more inclusive global economy.
Thank you for framing all of that, Achim, and you really pointed to some very, very key messages that we're all interdependent, and it's not about charity. But Sweden is one of the countries that really stand up for 1% of GDP going to development cooperation. And we've done that for a long time. I don't see any big protests against that, although there's some differences in opinion on that even in Sweden. But I think more countries would follow us, but they don't. Why do you say, Matilda?
No, but I'd like to start off by saying, sort of, if you in sort of the international society, everybody looks upon Sweden and know that we carry a big leadership, and I'm proud of that. We've done that for many years, and we will stick to that. But I must say that it's not something that you can take for granted. Look in Sweden, the two biggest opposition parties, they don't stick to that Sweden should continue to use 1% out of GNI to development cooperation. So it's not something, in my point of view, that you can take for granted. And also we need in Sweden to get Swedish voters and Swedish citizens, more of Swedish citizens, to actually say, yes, we want to be, we want to do this. We want to use our public money to international solidarity. More people in Sweden need to raise their voices and say that this is what we want to do, and also hopefully use their right to vote in that direction. But saying that, I think what we are touching upon here is absolutely crucial, because it's only 3 countries in the world who actually give 1%, Sweden, Norway and Luxembourg, and a lot of countries don't even reach UN's goal of 0.7. So, and the needs are so much bigger than sort of the budget for development cooperation actually can embrace. So, of course, from the Swedish perspective, we are working a lot with trying to find ways to use our development cooperation money as a catalyst to bring in other private money because it's necessary. And we're doing a lot of work to get other countries to use more of their money because there are rich countries who could provide more and reach the UN target. But I think, as I also said before, that development cooperation money and engagement, it's one part of trying to put the world in another more sustainable direction. But it's only one part. There are a lot of actors that need to step in.
And that was my next question, actually. So, I mean, what can we do more, even if all countries would provide 1% of GDP, would that be enough? Probably not. I mean,
but we would be in a much better place.
Absolutely. What more would we need in order to kind of live up to the environmental conventions and really meet all the challenges that we have? Some connected to poverty, but others are also very much present in rich countries, to be honest. So what's your take on that? What can we do more?
Well, as I said, I think we can do more to actually sort of use the money to attract also private money, because that's will get us much further. But then of course sort of the developed countries, they need to take their responsibility to actually reduce the emissions and use the technique and new research and so on to form more sustainable societies. And we also need to take the responsibility to stick to what we have promised the developing countries, and they need access to finance and to finance for adaptation, as well as financing more maybe for adaptation nowadays. And that's something that I'm myself have worked with for many years, also with you. And I think Sweden, we need to keep on pushing for that kind of leadership. But I think we all need to realize that we are facing a lot of challenges, and that will affect us. But as I said, I think there is a positive agenda in this, that we will live better lives in a more sustainable world. And being Swedes, we know how to do change. We have taken Sweden from a very poor country to a welfare state, and now we can show that we can take the next step. But we need to do it fair and just, so everybody can actually come along in this transformation. It's not easy, but we need to believe it can be done. At least I need to believe that.
But that's true. We have a good narrative in Sweden, going from an agricultural, very poor country some 100 years ago, 120 years ago, until here. So it is possible with a change. But Achim, what's your view on what do we need? What do we have to do more in order to see real results and real change? Is it about the narrative? Is it about the money? Is it about more conventions without...
I think probably a lot of people would argue no more. Well, that's always welcome, yes. But I think we don't necessarily need to look to more negotiations, to more process. We need to look to more enabling conditions. I think, I mean, to me it has been striking to follow the last few weeks when in Europe we suddenly conduct a debate about energy security that many of us have actually been trying to bring to the forefront of thinking about the future of energy in Europe for the better part of 2 decades. And yet it takes a war to actually suddenly allow us to do things that beforehand we were told by energy specialists, by economists, by leaders in industry would ruin our economies, namely an accelerated transition away from oil and gas and coal. It's remarkable, I don't know how many of you, for instance, follow different renewable energy technologies, but I've been struck by how in less than probably a 12-month period, green hydrogen, which was one of the sort of outliers of potentially adding more to our renewable energy infrastructure, has exploded onto the world scene. There are now dozens of green hydrogen plants being actually built. And one that I listened to in the last few weeks with astonishment is a $10 billion investment in a green hydrogen production facility in Namibia that could be already producing hydrogen maybe in 3 to 4 years from now. Why does it take us often so long to, combine an extraordinary opportunity for Namibia that has extraordinary good renewable energy conditions, better than anything in many parts of the world, so it can produce an endless amount of renewable energy, use it to produce hydrogen, convert it into ammonia, transport it to different markets of the world, and essentially light up and power its own economy as a byproduct of a major new export industry, creating jobs, clean energy for its own domestic economy, and enabling the world to decarbonize. And, there are projects like this happening all over the world suddenly. So I think we we have to demand more honesty from our leaders in government, in industry, but also in our local communities and municipalities, because we're all pretending that we want to have the world change, but we're not willing to take consequential steps. Now, some of that has to do also with economics. I think there is a very significant role, and where countries such as Sweden, I think, have also a very pioneering role. Regulatory frameworks change the way that we act as consumers, as producers, as investors. It is a travesty in my mind that much of the financial world to this day, with everything we know, is still investing in an economy of yesterday simply because it pays and because it is allowed and because the incentive structure doesn't take the $430 trillion of wealth. That's actually the amount of money we have in the world today, to invest in something as simple as switching from oil and gas to solar, wind, geothermal, green hydrogen. An existential risk, and yet we seem to be almost like deers in the headlights. So to the Greta Thunbergs out there and to all the young people who are actually saying to us, what on earth are you doing? I can only say, yes, you are absolutely right. And in practical terms, I think we go back to how do we get to, let's say, a paradigm of green economic transition. I said earlier on with the United Nations Association here in Sweden that, you know, economics is often portrayed as if it's a physical science. It's actually not. It's a social science. Economics is a set of choices that you translate into a set of policies. And interestingly enough, very often in the way that we make the incentives for our economies to function, deliver different outcomes. So let's change the rules of our economy, and very quickly you will find that we're actually able to have very different outcomes. Why else does Denmark have today 70% renewables? And you know, a couple of neighboring countries have not even gotten to 10%. So that's, I think, part of the answer, and many others, obviously, that we could debate.
Yes, so the realization about that there's a positive change there that is possible, and that we need to believe in it, and we also need to set up our regulatory frameworks in order to really push that forward. And I think that is also the role of countries such as Sweden and Denmark and others that are really investing in that type of regulatory framework and showing the way. And Namibia was a great story to hear.
Can I add one more
yes,
example, which also gives an interesting connection between 50 years ago. Stockholm was also famous because of Indira Gandhi and the way that she brought, let's say, the face of poverty as part of the debate about how you think about the future in sustainability terms. Few people realize today that India is now implementing a 450 gigawatt renewable energy infrastructure program that it is implementing in its economy today. And so also India, and not only some of the countries that we are more familiar with, have become leaders in this economic transition from an existential point of view, but also from an economic point of view. And I think this is where we need to understand how different policies produce very different outcomes.
Exactly.
Sorry, just to offer that as an
and I just want to add a little thing. No, because aligning sort of finance to sustainability is crucial, of course. But I also would like to say, when you mentioned Indira Gandhi, I think we have to, and I think Sweden has a role to play there as well. Always work with gender equality and with women and girls, because we know that they are disproportionately more affected when it comes to climate change, poverty, and so on. But we also know that women, they need to be at the table where the decisions are made when it comes to how we invest and how we form more peaceful societies and sustainable peace and sustainable societies. So more women at the table as well. Yeah.
That's a good point, and Sweden is also a pioneer by actually having a feminist foreign policy. Could you say something about how that
a little bit more on that?
You already explained the importance of having women at the table, but is this affecting also Sweden's climate policies or how we are relating?
Yeah, but absolutely, and sort of we were the first country who adopted a feminist foreign policy, and I'm very proud of that, and more countries are following, and that's a good thing, I think, and I think it's. You just look at how the reality are. Women are more disproportionately affected by climate change and poverty and so on. But we also know that if we empower women, that is the best way to fight poverty. And we also know that women can do more, but they can't get access to finance. So this is something that needs to be changed, and we are working with this constantly in our feminist foreign policy and development cooperation. But of course, here we can do a lot more. But also, if you look upon sort of a lot of our development cooperation work is channeled through sort of a geographical development cooperation, and look upon the sort of the African strategy that we got. I think 80% or something out of everything we do in Africa has a gender target what we are doing. So so absolutely, this is important for Sweden. It's a part of our feminist foreign policy, and I think, and I'm proud that we were the first country, but I'm also proud that other countries are following us.
But that's also with Agenda 2030 that you see that all the targets are interlinked and they can actually also enhance each other. But Akim, you were asked on your expectations earlier on for Stockholm Plus 50, and then you answered, and you said very eloquently that the time for incrementalism in an era of transformation is a hindrance. In plain English, could you explain what this means?
Incrementalism is essentially a way of saying that you believe little steps and lots of them over a long time is enough, and clearly it isn't. On many of the things that we consider to be a danger to human well-being, to our future, we are running out of time. So I think Stockholm Plus 50 must also be a moment where we go from the incremental steps of creating consensus in our societies, getting some leaders in industry to finally lead on some issues, to real scalable systemic change. And I'll give you a very small illustration. And it doesn't always have to be immediately clear how you will do it. In our new strategic plan in UNDP, and I'm very grateful to the member states that they allowed us that license, I said to our teams around the world, and I said to member states, if we really consider climate change to be an existential threat, how can the development program of the United Nations spend the next 4 years finding a few projects in which we're going to put some more photovoltaic panels into action? And we must make the issue of climate change a central responsibility of UNDP. So we now have in our strategic plan the almost impossible aspiration to help 500 million people over the next 4 years to gain access to clean and affordable energy. We don't know yet how we're going to do this, but I think it is the only right thing to do, which is to say nothing that we do in UNDP from here on onwards can ignore the threat of climate change, and therefore we must think of the impossible. And some might call it a moonshot, others might call it delusional. I call it taking responsibility in an institution that is one of the largest in the UN, one of the largest in the world of development cooperation. If we are not willing to commit to a totally different, non-incremental approach to this, how can we ask anyone else to do it?
Great. Time is running out. I have just one last question to both of you, and you must answer very, very shortly. What would you like to say to young people, children that are watching us right now? Do you have a message for them?
That they are absolutely crucial Every generation need to have the spirit and the fight for a more sustainable future, and everything we do for them, and they are the ones who push us ahead, and we need that push. It's the adults we are responsible for now. We need to do our part, but we need the young people to push us harder.
Thank you. Achim.
I agree. Believe in the power of one, and above all, believe in the fact that there is millions like you out there who, if you can connect with them, you can actually change what happens next in the world. We've seen it, and I think all of us are hoping that our young people will be back out on the streets, but also on stages, in television cameras, in stadia, in newspapers, and doing what they actually are entitled to do, which is to say, don't sell us a future that is not credible anymore, and take responsibility. And I think it'll make us all get up in the morning with, first more pressure, but also more motivation.
Thank you so much, both Minister Krantz and Administrator Steiner, and thank you so much for this interesting talk. I think I will stand up now for the final words and say to you viewers that at UNDP Hour tomorrow, we will discuss climate and inequality, how the impacts of the climate affects different groups differently, and solutions aligned with the concept of climate justice. You can see the discussions by joining us here in Stockholm or by viewing the streaming via Twitter or the We Don't Have Time website. Follow the hashtag UNDP Hour to take part in discussions. Now, thank you very much to the audience for joining us. Thank you to our most notable speakers for all their excellent reflections. I am Isabella Lövin. Thank you and goodbye.